Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
I mean,
Thank you all. All right. Yimol, right? We are really taking this apart, right? Peeling the onion. So again, this duplication of and this emphasis, right? And understanding as many implications as we can under this circumstance regarding Yimol. Mikan, from here we derive Yisrael Arel, that if there's an Israelite who is uncircumcised, a male Israelite who's uncircumcised, Shelo Yimol, he should not perform circumcisions. Okay, let's take a look here. This becomes clarified also. Al pi hadrasha, right, according to that interpretation, Demisha hu mal, that the one who performs the circumcision, hu yimol, he should be himself be circumcised, kemavoar lamala, as we've already mentioned above. But the point is here, in there we were making a general statement, but here we're talking specifically about the situation where the person's an Israelite, v'ayre b'Yisrael. But here it's dealing with an Israelite, arel, in other words, an Israelite who is uncircumcised. That's here, it's defining, more clarifying the circumstance. She'eino mal mechamat shemefir brit, right? The point here is that we're not talking about an Israelite who is uncircumcised because he has an intention to profane the covenant. In other words, he as an Israelite doesn't want to practice it. He's simply rejecting that notion. In other words, he's not doing it as we would say lahachis, right? He's not doing it out of stubbornness or rebellion against the mitzvah. We're not talking about that. Aval she'eino mal, here we're talking about a circumstance where he is not circumcised. Mechamat shemetu achiv, mechamat milah. There's a situation where if his brothers, right, died once because they had hemophilia, for example, and they died because circumcision was performed on them. So there is actually a halacha that I think it's two children die on account of circumcision, the third son should not be circumcised, right? Or so that, in other words, it happened, right? Or shelo nitchazka briuto, or because he wasn't healthy enough as a child, right, as a baby, he wasn't strong enough, ad sakana, right, to a point where it would be dangerous, who lo limo, for him to be circumcised. In other words, here we are talking about a situation where he's not circumcised because of circumstances. If it were up to him, he'd be circumcised. But because of these circumstances, they prevent him. Hahu mutar limo. So we might think that because he himself was uncircumcised only because of these situations beyond his control, right? Right. That he should be allowed to perform circumcisions. We should think that. Dekevan de meonis enomilo, because meonis from it was a forced situation. He isn't circumcised because circumstances forced him not to be circumcised. Heve kamo de mahul. We should consider him as if he is circumcised. In other words, as I said, if it were up to him, he would have been. So the intention is there. There was the intention to be circumcised. It's just that the situation was such that he couldn't be. And he says, and see in the Talmud Bavli, Avodah Zarah, the tractate Avodah Zarah, page 27a, Ubeyoredea. Now we're talking about the Shulchan Aruch, right? In Yoredea, Siman, chapter Reish Samech Dalet, that's 264, Seif Aleph, paragraph 1. So it's just so important that the person who performs the circumcision be circumcised. And despite the fact that we would think that he should be able to perform the circumcision one has to be circumcised. That's the law. Okay. Next, now we're on to the next verse. So let's take a look at it. Here we go. For Arel Zachar, and a male uncircumcised individual, Asher lo yimol epsar oloto, who does not circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, v'nichreta hanefesh hahi me'ameha, such a soul shall be cut off from its people. So now we're talking about the consequences of intentionally not wanting to be circumcised, of profaning this covenant. Let's go on. It briti hefar. There's that word. He has profaned my covenant. So it's a very powerful verse, and of course challenging in its own way. And it's a reason why I believe that that circumcision, this covenant of circumcision that was given to our patriarch Abraham, was perhaps a suggestion as to immortality, right? As to offer that possibility. In other words, I think it is a very basic concept within Judaism, is that while there may be a lot of grace involved in granting human beings immortality, nevertheless, part of our purpose in living is to deserve it, to work towards it, to achieve it, which gives you a purpose, at least one purpose amongst others, to live. Right. So let's take a look. For Arel Zachar, and a male uncircumcised individual. Tanya, so Tanya means it's a pretty early source, right, of Mishnaic times, i.e. prior to the year 200. Minayin lemila shebeoto makom. How do we know, actually, that circumcision is supposed to be on the penis? How do we know? And he's going to explain why do we even ask such a question, right? Why wouldn't we assume it? Because the word milah simply means, right? The circumcision simply means the cutting off of something, right? So let's take a look. I think this is it. I just want to be sure. Please forgive me. Yes, it's okay. It's mem, right? So comment mem. Here it is, mem. Ritzonolomar, what's he trying to say? Daha matzinu, because indeed we find Shem Orla, this noun or this term Orla, which means something uncircumcised. Gam b'sfatayim. It actually refers also to the lips. We use that. That term is found in the Bible. Here it is. Moses himself says, Va'ani arel, there it is, svatayim, I'm of uncircumcised lips. And that's Parshat Va'era, the Torah portion of Va'era. Uvalev, we also see that this term is used regarding the heart, or lat levavchem. This in the Torah, in Parsha Va'etchanan and Deuteronomy, it says, the foreskin of your hearts. Something like that, right? Uva ozen, it talks about it regarding the ear. Hine orla oznam, right? Behold the foreskin of their ears. Okay. Something that is preventing. So clearly Orla seems to have some connotation of a barrier of some kind, right? Let's keep going. So that's the reason why they're asking this question. Amar Rabbi Natan, said Rabbi Natan, Dichtiv, because it states, for Arel Zachar, this particular verse that we're looking at, for Arel Zachar, right? And a male Arel, a male an uncircumcised male, Asher lo yimol, who does not perform circumcision, ipasar orlato, that is to say, the flesh of his orla, right? It doesn't say, right, of his penis, it says orla, makom shenikar bein zichrut kevut. So that's because we understand that is a place, because it says zachar, it's a place where we can recognize, it's clear the difference between masculinity and femininity. Okay, and that's how we know this is where it's to be performed. Now, just for a second, we could say just look at the question itself, right? Which is interesting, right? That they care very much to make sure that what they're doing is the right thing. This is found in Tractate Shabbat, page 100, and looks like 108 A. And that's because Tractate Shabbat one of the chapters deals with the issue that we've been dealing with as far as the conflict of law between performing circumcision and observing Shabbat. And let's take a look. Ien b'Yorei Deah. Take a look at the Shulchan Aruch in Yorei Deah, Hilchot Melicha. This is interesting, right? Here we're talking, it wasn't what you didn't necessarily expect, right? These are the laws of salting. That is, that we, in order to kosher meat, we have to salt it. Siman, okay, again, chapter Ayin Bet, chapter 72, Seif Bet, right? This paragraph 2. It looks like Bahaga, so this is got to do with the Ramah. So again, that's the way these glosses are put in as a Haga, right? Le'inyan melichat halev, where he talks about the salting of the heart of the animal. In other words, in order to make the heart of the animal kosher, even though the animal was properly slaughtered. Remember, one of the intentions behind this slaughtering is to remove as much blood as possible, right? And so when it comes to certain organs, especially like the liver and the heart, they have an excessive amount of blood. And so we use salt to draw out as much blood as possible. And in fact, with the liver, I know one is supposed to broil it as well, because broiling also goes further than just simply salting it. Okay. So this is the language we're going to quote the Ramah. V'nohagin lachatchila, and there's a practice, right? No, a minhag, remember custom, lachatchila, to begin with. Before you start the salting or anything else, lachtoch or lat halev, that is to cut looks like, right, the foreskin of the heart, right? What does it mean? Mipnei kibutz hadam, right? Because the blood is collected shebatocho in it. So the chambers, probably he's talking about the chambers of it, that it isn't simply a question of salting it, but that you have to cut up the chambers of the heart, again, because of all the blood in it. Ve'eno ela lechumra. It's simply strict. It's not because it wouldn't be kosher otherwise. It is going above and beyond. Lechumra means to be, when taking a strict position. Uzahirut ba'alma. And again, it's simply being careful. We shouldn't see this as a halacha, and the purpose for this minhag is simply because there's just so much blood there. We want to be careful, and we want to make sure we're trying to get rid of as much of the blood in the heart of the animal as possible. Ad kan lashono, end of quote. V'katav al zeh hashach. So again, a later commentator, halachic commentator, Siftei Kohen is the shach, right? Wrote about it, v'zelushno, so we're quoting him. Now it took me a while, uverkanti. So the Rekanati, here's his age, was a Kabbalist, right? Rekanti. A posek means a halachic decisive who lived in the town of Rekanati, right? So he wrote Parshat Lech. He wrote a book which is following the order of the Torah, right? Katav. This is what the Rakanti wrote in his book, and this is what he says: Uva avur, right? And because ki habrit hidugmat alev. Interesting. He says that it looks like that the covenant, the bris, right? In this case, we're talking about this covenant that God made with Abraham, I think he is talking about. He says it's an example of the heart. Or he's saying that if you're talking about a covenant is something that you do in your heart. It's possible that he's also saying, that when you make a covenant, essentially your heart is moving you to make such a commitment. But let's see, go on. So he says, because of this, lachen chodchim gam chadud halev, okay, bereshito, right? So the chidud of the lev, this may be the place where the heart in the animal is sharp. Chad means sharp. So for this reason, one cuts also this sharp point, I believe is what he's saying, of the heart, bereshito, at its very start. Laha'avir misham, in other words, to remove from there, kitot hatuma. Kochot hatuma, to remove from it the strength of impurity. So this whole issue of impurity is an arcane and very deep subject within Judaism. And some of it has to do with a mental, emotional state, and it's also connected to certain physical things as well. That connection that is an emotional connection to things that are also certain things that are also physical. And this removal of this particular point in the heart is symbolic of this. Vezehu, and this is what is meant with when it says, Umaltem it orlat levachem. In other words, when the Torah says, you shall circumcise the flesh of you, or the orla, right, the foreskin of your heart, he's saying that it actually there is a mitzvah, or a reason for this practice. That when the Torah says that, maybe the Rekanti is considering this a mitzvah of sorts, but he's taking that and saying it isn't just a metaphor, right? When we talk about we're talking about the foreskin of your hearts. We're talking about, again, our emotional rejection of divine command or even divinity itself, that it comes from a certain emotional place, and describing it being in our hearts, and certainly that could all be metaphoric. But what the Rekanti is saying is that there's actually a practice, a physical practice of when we kosher an animal to do this with the heart of the animal to fulfill this statement in the Torah as literally as possible. Right, Ad kan lashono, end of his quote. V'lashon hashach, and so what the Shach said, ulafela, right? And it's amazing, right? Shelo heviu shnehem, that the two of them, right? That is the Shach and the Rekanti, they didn't propose et hakatuv, what is written be'inyan zeh be'pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, that in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which clearly precedes them by several hundred years, okay, there's this midrash, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and this whole subject is discussed earlier on, and they don't make reference to it, is the point he's making. Okay, and where do you find it? In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Perek Kaftet, chapter 29, Bezeh halashon, with this expression. Here it goes. The orlat halev, right? Eina minicha, and this foreskin, so to speak, right, of the heart. And maybe one can call it the stubbornness in this case of the heart. Eina menicha lasot ritzon haboreh, does not allow us, it prevents us from performing the desire, the will of our Creator. Ule'atid lavo, this is all in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, right? And in the future, HaKadosh Baruch Hu masir et orlat halev, the Holy One, blessed be He, will remove this orla of our hearts, may alehem, from people in the future. Shinemar, all going on here. Shinemar, as it states in Ezekiel chapter 36, V'hasiroti et lev ha'evan mibsarchem, and I shall remove the heart of stone from your flesh. Ulefize, And according to this, halo yesh semach nachon leminhag. So for this reason, there's a really reliable source, right? It's something a proper thing to rely on, right? Leminhag hasarat halev, to this minhag, this custom of removing the heart, uminiat tchilato, and the withholding, of achilato. This is achilato, right? And preventing it from being eaten. Ka'asher osin kain bekama mine ma'achalim, right? As one practices in this way with a number of types of food, mipnei shemitamtim halev ukadama, because we believe that eating that food somehow blunts our understanding, etc. Ukamevu'ar besof horayot. This is also mentioned at the end of Tractate Horayot, page 13b, Uva Yoredeya, and in the Yoredeya, Siman Pei Aleph, that would be chapter 81, Le'inyan Hanaka, regarding nursing. In other words, I imagine the subject there is certain foods that a woman who's nursing should avoid from feeding her child, because there was a belief that the milk could prevent certain developments within the child, could affect the development of the child. So, interesting. Any comments before I go on? Okay.
Just briefly,
Yes.
all of a sudden we're into the spiritual aspects.
Yes, we
more
are.
than the mechanical and the legalistic. That's
In this,
all.
right, in this particular case, yes.
In this
But
right. That's
But
all.
there's also the physical aspect I'm saying, because he is saying that what we do is we remove this part
Yes.
of the heart, etc., and that's all physical.
Yes.
And he's showing the connection, the physical connection to spiritual things.
Yes.
But where the one ends and the other begins isn't so clear, that we really are this combination of physical and spiritual.
Yeah. Okay. That's all. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe I can take a chance to do a little bit more. Okay. Here we go. All right. For Arel Zachar. So again, a male uncircumcised, an uncircumcised male. Androgynous, right? If a child is born androgynous, in other words, showing signs of masculinity and femininity, ein mechalalim alav et Shabbat. One does not, if the eighth day after his birth, or she's birth, right, occurs on Shabbat, you do not violate the Shabbat to circumcise the child. You will wait. Why? Shinemar va'arel zachar, because of the emphasis of this zachar, male uncircumcised child. Asher lo yimol, which is not circumcised, et basar olato, the flesh of his firstborn, v'nichrita nefesh, such a soul shall be cut off. Ma Talmud lomar zachar. What is Scripture teaching us with this word zachar? In other words, normally it says va'arel, and very often it says va'arel, and it's talking about males, it's talking about men, right, who have foreskins. Right? So why the use of this word zachar? Ad shehe kulo zachar. So in other words, it has to be very clear that he is completely male, and if this is the case, if he is completely male, v'nichrata, in that case, if he doesn't have himself circumcised, if the child is not circumcised, that soul will be cut off. All right, let's take a look. Near habiur, that it would appear that to clarify, or the explanation of what's going on is de kevan de ikar hatam, right? That the main reason, right, the essential reason, shemilah docha Shabbat, that circumcision overrides the Sabbath, umipnei shehi aseh sheyesh bakaret, is because it is a positive commandment that involves excision. In other words, if you don't do it, there are many commandments which are negative commandments, which are thou shalt nots, where if you do that, there's karet involved. But this is a positive commandment, that says if you don't do this, there will be karet. Imkain, and for this reason, b'milah kazo, right? In a case of circumcising an androgynous male, she'ein ba karet, that it says, what this is clarifying is that unless the child is completely male, the whole little piece doesn't apply. In other words, if you don't circumcise an androgynous child, there is no consequence of karet. That's the point, right? And because in this particular case, there is no karet, mimela, automatically, eina dochet haShabbat. It's not going to override the Shabbat, because we're saying that the only reason why circumcision on the 8th day overrides the Shabbat is because of this punishment associated with the violation of the commandment. V'kevan de mila androgynous ein ba karet, and he says, and since circumcising an androgynous male or female rather androgynous child, ein ba karet, there is no karet if you don't do it. K'moshe katuv la'el, as we said above, b'pasuk yud, when we are looking at verse 10 and note 28, mimela eina dochet haShabbat. So we see. That's why it doesn't override the Shabbat. V'yein od lefanenu, and see ahead, Rosh Perek Tazria, at the beginning of Parshat Tazria, that's in the book of Leviticus, and we'll see more about that subject when we get to it. And that's what I'm gonna stop here, the share, and see if anybody would like to comment on what we're dealing with. Yeah, Mead.
No,
You're
I
set.
said my piece. I'm listening.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment, question? Yes, David? Should I say Linda? Yes.
You can say Linda. You can say
Yeah.
anything you want.
Right. Well, can't get away with it necessarily, but go ahead. Yes.
If a male is not circumcised on the 8th day,
Yes.
because of a medical issue,
Yes.
okay, and he's not circumcised at all because of that medical issue,
Yes.
can he be, quote, circumcised with a pinprick?
No, that's a great question. No, in that case, it doesn't happen. Basically, if you look at the context of the pinprick, right, it happens when when the foreskin has been removed without the intent of entering the covenant. So that's what we very often have nowadays, is the reason why we have the hatafat Brit is because the individual may have been circumcised in the hospital, and consequently that's what we do. But it is no situation that I'm aware of where you use the pinprick when the person is actually still has their foreskin.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure of that. Okay. Yeah. But it's a great question. Definitely legitimate. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to
Right.
stop the recording with that.